Well, hello, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started a bit here. I want to welcome you all wherever you might be. We have lots of people from around the globe joining us, so good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending upon where you are. I'm Sion Winship, and I'm on the board of the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design. I'd like to welcome you to our first hybrid event of the year. We are broadcasting this event live from the Neutra office in Silver Lake, California. And we are also, of course, holding this over Zoom. And if anyone will be missing part of this or would like to see more of it, I'd like to let you all know that we will be recording this and you'll be receiving a link to the recording so that you can view it again at your leisure. I wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about the Neutra Institute. We are a nonprofit organization that was started by the architect Richard J. Neutra in 1962. Now, our mission is to preserve the Neutra legacy and to promote creative research and design that benefits people and the planet. And so today's program is really a bit in service of the second half of the mission. In 1954, and you'll hear more about this, but Richard Neutra published his book, Survival Through Design. And it was about what he termed biorealism, meaning his recognition of the inherent and inseparable relationship between man and nature, as well as his own philosophical approach to design. In 2023, next year, the Institute will be publishing a new version of Survival Through Design. And so in anticipation of that, we have asked Professor Arbib to read the work and to prepare his presentation today and share some of his thoughts so many years later on what Richard Neutra was thinking about and writing about. Here, I would like to introduce our speaker. Michael Arbib was born in England, but he grew up in Australia, where he earned his Bachelor of Science in Pure Mathematics from Sydney University, and then later went on to receive his PhD in mathematics from MIT in 1963. After 5 years at Stanford, he founded the PhD program in the Department of Computer and Information Science at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And he also later joined the University of Southern California in 1986 and was the Fletcher Jones Professor of Computer Science, as well as University Professor and a Professor of Biological Sciences, Biomedical Engineering, Electrical Engineering, Neuroscience, and Psychology. So as you can see, Professor Arbib can do it all. He's currently an adjunct professor of psychology at the University of California, San Diego. His first book, rather, on these topics was entitled Brains, Machines, and Mathematics. And of course, he's written numerous other books and papers, but today we are here to celebrate the publication of his most recent book, When Brains Meet Buildings, A Conversation Between Neuroscience and Architecture, and to maybe bounce a little bit off of that, what Richard Neutra has been talking about for years in this field. If you haven't already had the chance to buy the book, I just wanted to let you know that on the heels of the event today, we will send out another copy of the Zoom link, which will take you to the publisher, as well as a promotion code that will enable you to save 30% when you purchase the book. So we will make all of that happen after the program is over today. And without further ado, I think we should just get started. So Michael, welcome, and thank you so much for reading the book and making this presentation.
Thank you. What was a little daunting about that introduction was the only department in the university that wasn't mentioned that I've been a professor of was architecture. And so I have to not only tell you I'm not an architect, but that I'm not an expert on Neutra either. And my remit today was, as someone who's thought about the relation between neuroscience and architecture, to read Neutra's classic book from 1954 and think about it in terms of what's happened in the 70 almost years since it was published, in thinking about the brain and in thinking about its relation to architecture. So that's the path I'm going to do. And what I've shown you here is the cover of the 1969 reissue, because that's the one that I've been annotating like mad for the last few weeks. And then against that, you can see the cover of the new book coming out in January or so. And just to note that the original reprint was introduced by Raymond Neutra, and the new version is being introduced by Barbara Lamprecht, who is here in person. In some sense, the story of the background starts at a meeting that Barbara and I were at together in Taliesin West, the old stamping ground of Frank Lloyd Wright, who was a seminal influence early in the Neutra career. And Juhani Ballasmaa, the Finnish architect, had written a book called The Thinking Hand, on a sort of embodied wisdom. How did the hand represent how the body moved, and how could drawing in some sense capture that? And since I was speaking right after him, I took the opportunity to develop themes from my book, How the Brain Got Language, in which I offer the idea that, yes, that the hands are in some sense embodied, but also they provide a powerful means of communication through gesture and pantomime. And I offered an evolutionary theory which took that as the basis over our long evolution to yield language as a symbolic system, but rooted in the practical means of the hand. And then, as we've already seen advertised, you are not allowed to leave the building until you've bought the book. Unfortunately, many of you are here by Zoom, so that won't be able to work. But so then at ANFRA Interfaces in January of 2016, I had the great pleasure of welcoming both Barbara and Raymond to speak at a meeting of ANFRA, the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. And I reproduced their kind dedications on my copy of the paperback. And just a few regrets before I get going. One is that the original book had no figures. The new reissue in 1969 had a portfolio of photos with interesting captions at the front, but no explicit linkage of the text. And so when I talk today, I'm going to use far more words than usual because I don't want to show the wrong picture. But I'm told that figures will appear in the new edition and that it will integrate the figures into the chapters in a way that will make it easier to see how Neutra's own work linked to what he's seeing. Because the nature of the book is really a very broad thought about how a man who is widely read in history and philosophy, who has practiced for decades in architecture, is very much concerned with physiology of people experiencing architecture, how he gathers his wisdom together from many years in a book, but he doesn't talk about his particular works with, as far as I can see, only one exception. So a sort of play that unfortunately doesn't work with English pronunciation is that we bring together Neutra and neuroscience. So I don't know whether to pronounce that as the shock of the new or the shock of the neu, but that is the theme of today's talk. So let me just say a little bit about the neuroscience of Neutra. I'm going to come back to it in detail after I've given you a sense of the overall work, but Neutra primarily uses the term physiology with the integration of brain activity with basic mechanisms of life support, such as breathing and other aspects of well-being. And I think this is the defining quote for his talk. Individual and social psychology will ultimately merge with brain physiology to guide the designer in his observation and creation of response patterns. And so when I talk of neuroscience, it will be in the same sort of way. I'm not just talking about studies of what's inside the head, but also what the brain can do in guiding our interaction with the built environment and with the people around us. Now, it's not surprising that after 70 years, Neutra's neuroscience is out of date. In fact, most of the word neuroscience didn't really exist in 1954. It only entered wide use in the 60s. In those days, people talked about neurophysiology and neuroanatomy. But the point about the book, and makes it valuable today, I think, is that many of his ideas on the general relevance of physiology to architecture remain relevant. So you can say, oh, well, the details of what the brain is doing, yes, they're out of date. But his observations are so enticing that we're invited to really think about, given what we know now, how can we bring that to what Neutra said, and then how can we enrich what he said? And so I close with this idea that this is in some sense a conversation. It's not a debate. I'm not going to say, oh, Neutra didn't know much about the brain. I'm here to say he knew a hell of a lot about architecture. He reached out to the brain science of his time, and we're invited to think about what would happen if that conversation were going on today. Okay, so one of the interesting things about the book, it's called Survival Through Design, and the word natural keeps recurring. And so there's a temptation to think, well, that's a return to nature, that sort of idea. But Neutra is at pains to remind us that we live in a world in which we can try to think what is natural for human beings in terms of our well-being, enough exercise, enough sunlight, enough fresh air, freedom from disease. But it can't be a natural world. And he spends quite some time, which I won't repeat, on a world transformed by mass production. We're so different from the 19th century because of that. One of the nice things about the book is that it's very enticing. Most of the chapters are short. They're illustrated, as I say, with interesting gems from history and philosophy, as well as insights into architecture, and also occasional flashes of humor. So to illustrate his idea that you can't go backwards, he has an anecdote about President Fillmore, who in 1851 installed a bathtub in the White House. And there was a great hue and cry. What does he think he is, a monarch? No other president ever had a bathtub in the White House. And so this was, I think, to make the point that some changes are conducive to our well-being and our survival, even if they were not there as a previous state of what we accepted as a natural part of the built environment. So I apologize. What's going to happen now is I'm going to be reading a lot of stuff to you because I want to give you a sense before I get into what's the relation to the brain. I want to get into what are some of the ways that Neutra set up the framework within which his encounter with physiology takes place. So I've tried to take a bunch of chapters and summarize them in a way that will do. I hope I can read in a lively enough fashion you won't all go to sleep. But if you do go to sleep, would the person next to you nudge you? Okay, so the numbering system here is that the first number is the number in the original edition, 5469. The right-hand number is the number in the new edition because certain chapters were omitted to encourage people whose attention span is not quite large enough for the original book. Okay, so we are concerned with sensory comfort and with general well-being, concepts badly needing physiological understanding. Now here's that statement: nature comprises all the requirements and characteristics of live organisms. This is a terribly unhelpful definition. And so the concept will be really, how does the natural change as we change the environment, and our ideas of what is necessary change. I may say this later, but I mentioned my work on the evolution of language. I don't think early humans had language, so language is unnatural. But we can't imagine humanity today without language being such an important part of our interactions. This is just one example of the way in which what is responsible for our life. We can't, I mean, this is what everybody's been going through with Zoom, right? If you can't talk to a real living human being, then that's not part of your well-being. So in a sense, we've had a massive global case study of the aspect of community. Okay, so as I say, at times Neutra will discuss nature separately from humans, talking about trees, sky, air, and discussing back to nature, but only to reject it in the sense that we have to really think about human construction, but accepting that it's often become ill-adapted to human health and physical and mental beings. That's really the challenge, that there seem to be some ongoing ideas about human well-being. My mention of language suggests they're different from what they were millennia ago. But as we build new buildings, new environments, we have to think these in mind. Okay, So physiology must direct and check the technical advance in constructed environments. So in other words, when we think about the building, we shouldn't just be thinking about the developer who wants to make a fast buck. We should be thinking about the people who will finally be using the building. How do we keep them healthy, both physically and mentally? Okay, so such designs must be conceived by a profession brought up in social responsibility. And I think that's, we're not going to get into it, but that's one of the big problems, is how can you be a responsible architect if your client wants you to do something irresponsible? Okay, chapter two, is planning possible? Can destiny be designed? This is an interesting excursion into philosophy, where he examines various religious and philosophical traditions, which ask, well, is man really separable from the world at large so that he can act upon it? What's the nature of free will? Things of this kind. My 5-hour version of this talk had a long discussion of free will, but that I wasn't free to discuss that because of time constraints. So anyway, Neutra concludes that we must plan and design and never lose sight of the ultimate consumer, the human species as a whole. He keeps talking about survival of the race, but it's not privileging one type of person over another. He's meaning the human race as a whole. And I've deleted the word race from these notes just to avoid confusion. But mankind cannot just vaguely float to survival. He's worried about those sort of people who say, well, we don't need to plan, we've got intuition, it'll all work out. On the way up, I was reading an article about the upcoming climate change conference, and the idea that, well, we were talking for a while about 1.5 degrees centigrade, but it's not going to happen because people just aren't taking the necessary steps. So you need plans and you need the will to implement them. So I might just mention there, I might refer to it on a later slide, but there's an interesting contrast. Think about 1954. This is 9 years after the end of World War II. It's a period when many countries that were colonies of Europe have split off from the empires. It's a period when a lot of cities are still damaged from the war and reconstruction. So the sense of rebuilding of human survival is in some sense very, very pregnant in terms of the knowledge of World War II, the knowledge of the evils of colonialism. And so perhaps for us, we have similar problems. I'll get to that in a little bit. Our man-made surroundings have technological trickery. They become a mold of destiny, there should be a U in there, of course, and the source of never-ending nervous strain. Well, we're at a time when we're all at Twitter about what Musk is going to do, for example, and this is a technological innovation which in some way improves human communication, but we're now so worried about the side effects of trivializing our life and being a sink of our time. So the construction of the contemporary scene, which would gratify human needs instead of frustrating them, which would further the smooth functioning of man's nervous system. Man means human throughout Neutra's book. Instead of imposing an intolerable strain on it, is a problem that will most certainly not be solved by lucky accident. And as I say again, Neutra does speak at some stage about part of the architect's work is to try to convince the client that some change in the brief is justified for human well-being, and that this is where language really comes into play, that besides designing a good building, you've got to persuade the client to pay for it and accept it. But of course, the trouble is that there are a lot of clients out there who are not going to be convinced. That's not our problem today. So this is just an amazing statistic. Human population, 1954, 2.7 billion. This month, it reaches 8 billion, a 3-fold increase. So what does survival of the human race mean? I mean, if it means we just swarm, like a cancer invading the face of the globe, we're surviving very well. But what's going to work? So as I've said, recovery from World War II, adjustment to colonialism, rampant inequality seem to be a problem in 54 today. Wars and rampant inequality continue. Billions lived in cramped and unsanitary conditions. Rising population and the move to reduce poverty has created a new challenge for climate change, which creates instability. And I just thought one little piece of optimism after that depressing slide is this is a measure of improvement. The percent of the world population living in global poverty has gone from 80% to perhaps 10%. That sounds good until you look at the measure of poverty, the household income of not more than $1.90 per day. So, okay. So, as I've already suggested, and as these two chapters we'll look at quickly reiterate, natural is a shifting target. He seeks well-being in a world of mass production and large cities, and that provides the new constraints that have to be faced. So he offers a broad historical perspective. He looks at the rise of the science in the 19th century. He looks at science can be misapplied. Some people took the ideas of Darwin on evolution to think of nature red in tooth and claw, and therefore your job was to be the animal with the biggest claws rather than an interest in helping those who were less advantaged than you. So in other words, slums could become comprehensible rather than something to be ameliorated. Again, a comment that might come later is that in the end, I think Neutra's work, at least as discussed in the book, is more for the middle class. So he doesn't talk about his very expensive clients, and he doesn't talk about those who are very poor. And so this would be interesting in enriching the perspective there. Anyway, just to finish the chapter 5 stuff, he wants a design approach that exhibits an attitude of sharpened, objective, all-around observation, while insisting that an intensive human art can thrive in this new atmosphere. So there are two things going on here. That is, you can't just, he's suggesting, use your intuition. You've got to know about physiology and sociology and so on. And that will provide new ways of constraining what you do. But on the other hand, he's saying that that's not going to provide a sort of algorithm that you just plug in. The client wants this. Here's human well-being. Here's social well-being. Turn the crank, and here comes up the design. The creative input of the architect is still going to be vital. In a way, I think some of you may have had this experience of being at loose ends when you don't have anything that you have to do. So you have total freedom, and freedom without any constraints at all is as bad as not having freedom. You need somehow a channel in which to be free. So I think that's, this is a new channel that can yield better buildings, but it still allows a great deal of creativity. He's very much influenced by Albert Lewis from the old world and Lewis Sullivan from the new world. And Sullivan famously has the slogan about form follows function. In my book, I discuss why I think most people misinterpret what that means. But here, the idea is he's following Sullivan, who pioneered the skyscraper and so on, and came up with a new idiom for thinking about architecture when you had steel inside the building and you had the high rising of the building and so on. And so the issue is he's inspired by this to say, we want to make the transition from old models like the Greek temple. He was sort of shocked at all these bank buildings that would say, well, to show you we're reliable, we will put up a facade that has nothing to do with what's going on inside. I'd love to see what he would think of the new Las Vegas. But anyway, so how do we come up with something that's adapted to the new materials, the new techniques, the new machine age, the possibilities of mass production? So I'm getting sick of reading this. You're probably getting sick of hearing it. So we can lament some of the features of the old. We want to design for the new. And one of the things he keeps coming back to is that humans develop habits. And that part of the challenge then for the architect is not simply to accept old habits. If he or she knows that these habits are in fact inimical to human survival or physical or mental well-being, then that's part of that job, is to find the way in which the building can create new habits. There's a nice example I read about recently. So the idea is the nudge. As that you don't force people to do things, but you make it easier for them to do one thing and another. So one example, you have a building, and as you enter the doors, to get to the first floor up, there's stairs right in front of you, and you have to go around the corner to find the elevator. So if you know you're only going up a floor or two, you'll be nudged to take the stairs, and that makes the building healthier for you. So this isn't an example from Neutra, but I think it's in the spirit of how can you make the building, in some sense, nudge you towards good habits that will be for your well-being. So again, let's just look at the last sentence. Again, he's saying, so let's not just do novelty for novelty's sake. Let's keep thinking about the physiology. Let's think about the innovations that are within that context of human well-being. A lot of the time, he's talking about the way in which these new insights are going global, and that even the former colonies are going to be looking towards new models of architecture designed for survival. So the one place I could find where Neutra actually describes a specific building is a project which shows that we can learn from regional vocabularies when we're in that region. And so here he talks about he was called upon to design a school in an island in the West Indies. I'm pretty sure it was Puerto Rico. And the schoolroom was originally designed in terms of the colonial design, which was you have a room with windows on one side, a wall on the other, because there had to be enough air in the room for the kids. The ceilings were very high. And he sort of said, no, this is the Caribbean, folks. We have trade winds. Let's open the building up on either side. We don't need a high ceiling to make sure enough air. The air can come through. It will be cooling. People won't sweat. It'll help combat the sultry atmosphere. And so that, I thought, was a very nice example of the way in which the vocabulary of what guarantees human well-being must also be responsive to the, on the one hand, yeah, some sense of the local tradition, learn from that, but also just understanding the impact of the local geography on the conditions of the design. And in that case, you may find that the vernacular architecture has more to teach you than others. Okay, so the second part of the talk, before I finally talk about the neuroscience, will be that he emphasizes the need for experiments, as I've mentioned. And there's only one place, I think, where he really talks at length about a study, and I'll just sketch that for you in a moment. But time and again, he's talking about, here's a study you could do to look at the effect of lighting. Here's a study you could do on this factor, that factor. And so one of the ways I think a reader can usefully reread Neutra's book is not only to get these general perspectives on what an architecture designed for well-being but reflects the modern age would be like, but also the notion that he keeps saying, how could you test this? How could you test that? And so, but in some cases, it just stops there. And the point, of course, is that's 70 years ago. So there are lots of publications in fields like ergonomics and environmental psychology that have conducted some of the experiments which are related to what he proposes or go well beyond them. So I'll return to that point in a moment. But the one example that's very interesting, I thought, was that where he talks about this large-scale study of elementary schools in Texas. And the guy he was working with was a psychologist named Harmon, who was very much interested in lighting and vision. And he had this slogan, we do not see to see, we see to act. Though, strangely enough, in fact, as far as I could tell, the study was really only on seeing to see rather than seeing to act. But there was this whole commission, physicians, dentists, orthopedists, educators, illumination engineers, and more, looking at the effect of light and brightness distribution. And an immense study. And so, for example, if you have poor lighting, then kids have to sit badly to be able to see what they're working on. And so you get problems of posture that are inimical to the health of the children. They even claimed that the way the kids ground their teeth was a problem of poor lighting. Now, the traditional, as some of you know, a major effort of Neutris was to open up the classroom, not just as we talked about in the West Indies, but especially in a climate like here in Southern California, to where you have the classroom is half inside, half outside, and so you're getting a lot more exposure to natural light. But here, this study was in terms of the conventional classroom, where you've got the light coming in just from a row of windows on one side. It was interesting. It said from the left-hand side, and that puzzled me for a moment. But then I realized that way, if you're right-handed, it doesn't cast a shadow. And once again, as a left-handed person, I saw the terrible prejudice of the world. But never mind. Okay, so what was interesting was there they came up with a scheme that said, yeah, take this light, take this classroom, take the light coming in from the left, but instead of having straight rows, arrange curves. They're not even concentric curves, and that way every child is positioned with their fixed desk to get optimal lighting for their work. And of course, again, since then we've seen a revolution in the classroom. I was just in Sydney, and Frank Gehry has a building there for the University of Technology, Sydney. And I was visiting to talk to the principals in the design process. But that's not what I bring to you in this discussion. It's that they had a radically new classroom. That is, the kids are arranged around a table, maybe 3 on a side, each with their own laptop in front of them. There is a screen to the left of them where they can project what they're doing, any one of them is doing, onto the screen to discuss it with the others. The lecturer doesn't really have a podium, but what he can do is alternate between showing a few slides that everybody will see on the big screen, or he can walk around and see what the individual teams are doing. Totally new idea of the schoolroom, and it would be fascinating to see what Neutris would have done with that idea, whether he would approve, and if so, how he would have done it. But it's a fascinating model that I'd like to know more about. But here I have to just introduce one more actor into the history, and this is John Paul Eberhard, who was for a while a director of the architectural foundation of the American Institute of Architects. And he ended up running a study on architecture and neuroscience. And this was the founding document, as it were, for the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. It started in about 2002, 2003. The book came out a few years later. And here he spent a year or two talking to the rich neuroscience community in La Jolla, California, where I'm from, talking to the neuroscientists at the Salk Institute and at the University of California, San Diego. He proposed we use neuroscience to establish a framework for design decision-making in architecture. And I don't believe he knew Neutris' book, at least he doesn't cite it, but he has a very similar program to enhance the quality of life through reduction of stress, increase cognition, and then I think things that Neutris doesn't pick up on the book: prolong productivity and enhance spiritual response. And so what Eberhard adds to Neutris, without in any way taking away from the various features that I've already mentioned, is firstly, of course, insights from the 50 years of neuroscience that had occurred between 1954 and 2008. And in particular, as we'll see, Neutris basically said there's an upper brain and a lower brain, end of story. But Eberhard begins to chart for us the fact there are many different brain regions, and we can begin to assign roles to them through interaction. what I think is a particularly important point is an attention to the different issues that arise when we take typology into account and the different needs of people in different types of building. And that issue of thinking about, survival of the whole race, great. But in particular, we're talking about how do we create well-being for people going about their survival in ways that are good for the larger community, but they do it in different types of buildings. So how does that factor into our attempt to make a rapprochement? And then here's a plethora of suggested experiments. On every few pages, there's another experiment he's suggesting. I must say that as a neuroscientist, I thought most of them were incredibly boring and there was no way I could be recruited to do them. But I think that just says that what we're on the cusp of, perhaps, is a new profession. It's a bit like there was engineering and now there's structural engineering. The structural engineer is specialized to really care about what's about a building in an earthquake, in strong winds and so on, and help think that through to complement the work of the engineer. And so there are already human factors people. How do we, as it were, extend that profession to bring in more neuroscience? And then a lot of the experiments that Eberhard adds to the Neutra list, I think, will be very important. Anyway, I just pick up then on chapter 46. And you see now it's only chapter 35 of the new edition. Community planning is an art, but one in need of a large scientific advisory board, and I love this, chaired by an expert in biology. And I thought, oh yes, here comes somebody who's an expert on mRNA, and he's been working on the COVID vaccine, but he's a biologist. Let's have him chair the commission. So that idea is charming, but the issue is, how do we get enough people who can bring a professional competence in biology to a deep understanding of architecture? And conversely, how can we have more architects who know enough of the biology and the psychology to engage in an important conversation? Okay, so just one more slide on Eberhard to reinforce the points I just made. He is, and I think this clearly fits in with Neutra's theme of people form habits. In some ways, we must cater to those habits for them to enjoy the building, but in other ways, the habits are maladapted to the modern world. They're maladapted to human well-being, so we have to help change the habits. And Eberhard is making the point in that spirit that buildings where people spend most of their time can influence the fundamental structure of the brain and thus affect thoughts and behaviors. And as I say, he takes that into a number of different typologies. Here are just 4, and I'll mention one more in a moment. How does classroom design affect the cognitive processes of children? That's not just a matter of general well-being, that's a matter of specific expertise. And of course, then at this troubled time in American politics, we can say, well, what are the teachers allowed to teach in this beautifully Neutra designed classroom? But that's a separate issue. At least we want to understand the cognitive processes of children so that we can help them develop and become independent, to some extent, independent thinkers who nonetheless understand certain key issues. The design of hospital rooms that impact the recovery rate of patients. Neutra talked about something that foreshadows a later study by Ulrich on studying people in hospital rooms, and the claim was those who had a view out the window to trees or whatever recovered faster than those who looked at a brick wall. And there are studies since then that qualify that, but that's interesting. How do working environments impact workers' productivity? And again, you sort of think about that, well, in a neutral way. You want to say it's not just increasing the number of bucks, a sort of Amazon warehouse that increases the productivity of the workhouse. That's not bad. of the workers is not at the same time conducive to the well-being of those workers. So how do you create a design that does both? It allows them to be productive in a way that respects their needs and doesn't burn them out. Sacred spaces, instilling a sense of awe. Now, sacred places is really interesting to me because this is a way in which you're designing it for people with a certain set of ingrained habits, right? And you're not going to change them. That's the whole idea. You're saying, oh, you're a Christian, you're a Hindu, you're a Sikh, you're a Jew. All right, fine. we accept those habits. Now, how can we build on that in a way that will increase, in some sense, your spiritual well-being on that basis? So that's an interesting trade-off. Another area that's gained a great deal of attention, especially by a man named John Zeisel, but by a number of other people since, is designing homes for people with Alzheimer's. And we don't understand what's going on all that much, but we begin to understand something of the progression of memory loss that comes with Alzheimer's. And so we can at least design around that in terms of what types of clues in a building can minimize the feeling of disorientation these people will have and enable them to get back to their room. I think one idea was, well, at least have a circular corridor. Anyway, so what he's saying then, in the spirit that I think extends and is consistent with Neutra, we want to respond to the cognitive experience of spaces and places. Now this is interesting, which, as you know, one of the things that Neutra did was design louvers that could automatically follow the sun to maintain shade in a building. So here we have something I've thought a lot about under the name neuromorphic architecture of adaptive technology that becomes part of the framework. And again, there's the problem of, are you adding it in a way that's just, hey, I've got a big machine around, and I've got some nasty little digital assistant that's trying to run my life, or am I really ameliorating things? But anyway, so I just bring Eberhard in because in some sense, although he's not influenced directly by Neutra, he's very much within that framework that survival through design is establishing. Okay. So two words of caution, right? So what if we turn from eye strain and posture to complex psychological barriers like learning? I mean, okay, you've improved the light in the classroom, you brought in some fresh air, so the kids are a little healthier, they're probably staying awake a bit more. But what about learning? So Peter Barrett is somebody who's been working in recent years on the impact of classroom design on pupils' learning. Here's a 2015 paper. And we corresponded recently as I was reading Neutra's book, and he says, well, the trouble is that bivariate correlations between light levels and learning are easy to find. Okay, turn off the lights, kids can't read as well. That's probably not an actual finding, but a lot disappear when a multi-level regression analysis is carried out of a full set of sensory inputs to the brain. So that's the sort of catch. And so that's one of the real challenges to future work in this area of coming up with experiments is how do you design experiments whose findings you can act upon rather than experiments that say, well, if all you did was just the lighting, then great. But of course, as an architect, you're going to be thinking about a lot more beside. So anyway, this is just the beginning. We have seen, as I've hinted at, a lot of work now in environmental psychology and ergonomics, for example, that fit this. If you just want a very recent review from last year, Higuera Trujillo, Linares, and Eduardo Macaño have just published an overall review of several hundred papers on the cognitive emotional design and study of architectural spaces. With so many references, it's a little overwhelming to keep track of it all, but so I think of it more as an informed bibliography that could lead you to studies that you may decide are worth your further attention. John Eberhard in his book talked about let's develop a database so that people can, whoever design problem can find the data they need. That, as I put in quotes, remains still a few years away. It's one of the permanent things. It's a bit like apparently, oh, never mind. So, and the other problem we've seen already is that a focused experimental result can be extended too fast. There was a study which had people look at photographs of buildings and said, oh, people have a preference for curved walls. But I saw one project where it sort of just randomly threw curves all over the place in the design, thinking that would be a good thing, and it wasn't. Okay, so finally, we get to the subject of today's talk in the last 5 minutes. No, oh well. So to repeat, the defining quote of the book, I say, is individual and social psychology will ultimately merge with brain physiology to guide the designer in his observation and creation of response patterns. And I've already indicated that we're going to talk about neuroscience, but with an understanding of its broader range. So here's a nice example, the power of illusion. So thinking about the visual sense and the ways we can act upon it. A famous aspect is the way a straight line can extend beyond a surface and create an illusion of space beyond that surface. And again, no reference to a particular work, so I just pulled one photo that some of you will recognize, where we see the beam is extended out beyond the window, and somehow gives you a feeling that that room is larger than it really is. But in 2 chapters, 20, also to be known as 17, and 21 to be known as 18, Neutra has a very nice discussion of the way in which we must take the other senses into account, and not just vision. So in chapter 20, he's talking about architecture illuminated by light, but then he goes on to talk about the way in which the sound can have a big impact on our space. The reverberatory aspect of a room can totally change it, whether you're talking about a restaurant or a church. So that's a familiar example. But then in 21, he really gets into the other senses which can come in, and very interesting catalog, because some of them you will have thought of, some of them perhaps you won't. Air currents, heat losses, aromatic exhalations, textures, and resiliencies. Okay, odors can provide a key to memory. Different wall materials have different temperature profiles. Some can feel cool, some can feel hot. So that can play a role depending on what you're designing for. And then he really gets very excited about the pull of gravity. And so, in fact, as you're sitting in a chair or lying in a bed, you are letting something help you resist the pull of gravity. So the ergonomics of furniture design becomes a very interesting task. But even in the design of houses and buildings and interactions, the fact that we're already working against gravity provides another constraint that we might not have thought about if we just focused on light and sound as our primary stimuli. Okay, so now let's talk about the brain. And for Neutra in 1954, and remember the book, although written in 54, is based on decades of thinking about physiology and architecture and history and philosophy. So I think the most important book for him is the book by Ivan Pavlovich Pavlov. We can see the great man on the right here. And his book was translated from the Russian, and it was called Conditioned Reflexes, an investigation of the physiological activity of the cerebral cortex. And I don't think we need to read the details, but we can just look at the figure. I think you all know Pavlov's dog. And so the idea was that in response to seeing food, the dog would respond by salivating in anticipation of eating the food. And what Pavlov did was he kept presenting the sound of a bell just before the sight of the food. And in the end, it sort of strengthened the synapses, so the sound of the bell alone was enough to excite the salivation response. So that's really what all the text says. And so Neutra's brain, not his actual brain, but the brain as featured on many pages of the book, is primarily understood as a lower brain supporting basic reflexes, which you can condition on basic survival things, keeping your blood pressure in the right limits, worrying about your glucose level, making sure you're breathing enough oxygen and so on. But then he contrast that with an upper brain that is going to have conditioned reflexes. And the idea is that these conditioned reflexes are going to be built on each other. So his view of a person is someone who may start with basic responses to a certain basic primitive set of stimuli, and then over time becomes conditioned to respond to more and more complex stimuli. And then a group of conditioned reflexes coheres to form a habit. And as I've already hinted, the task of the designer is to build environments that will help build healthy habits oriented to human survival, and provide appropriate stimuli for healthy behavior. So that's in a nutshell the brain of Neutra. Now, what I want to do, and go a little bit more over the 1 hour limit. Well, actually, it's not from an hour from when I started, but anyway, I want to learn from Neutra's insights, but I now want to think about recent findings in neuroscience. And there are so many of them. I'm going, I think it's just over a week from now, we have the beginning of the annual meeting of the Society for Neuroscience. And I've lost track whether it's 15,000 or 20,000 presentations. But trying to summarize all those for you proved impossible. So here are 4 things that I've thought about a lot. So I assure you, this is just a personal sampling. And if you talk to other neuroscientists, you'd find other bodies of data of more value to you. But action-oriented perception, affordances, knowing that there are different forms of learning and memory, and thinking about the brain not just as an upper and lower level, but as a system of systems. And I think all of these are things that a Neutra of today could accept. So the first concept I want to bring up to you is the action perception cycle. The other is we're not driven by stimuli. In general, we have some goals that we're trying to pursue, and that we, so if we look at this cycle on the screen, if you go to the upper right, you can see that in addition to locomotion and action, where we're actually acting upon the world, a lot of our work is perceptual exploration, eye movements, hand movements. And these between them help us change the selection of what part of the world we're currently experiencing. We attend to some things, we ignore others. And then on that basis, we can update our plans or find what we're looking for and then act. And so we go in this cycle where it's as much the actions driving what we perceive as it is what we perceive driving how we act. And so the idea of conditioned reflexes in terms of, well, we're just sitting here and then a stimulus comes in and bang, we respond is not the way it works. And so I think Neutra would probably say, well, of course, but that's not the way he writes when discussing these things. So, for example, to fit in with the Eberhard point, our tasks and goals will lead us to seek out buildings with particular typologies, adjust the buildings to people with different capabilities and so on. Okay, what about affordances? Here the idea is that J.J. Gibson, an American psychologist, came up with this word in the 70s. And the notion is that to act, our perception is trying to find the opportunities for that action. And if we're walking down, this is Las Ramblas in Barcelona, if we're walking down the street, our attention might be drawn subconsciously to this woman in yellow. She's sort of in the middle, she has a distinctive color. But if we're actually walking down the street, what we're looking for is a gap in the crowd we can walk through. But the exciting point that's added to this is that if you're walking along and somebody is coming from your periphery and you haven't even noticed them, nonetheless, you will jump aside because your peripheral vision drives something called optic flow that drives an estimate of time until contact that tells you how to move to avoid that collision taking place. So there's that interesting mixture of conscious and non-conscious affordances. And in some sense, when you're designing, you have both those in mind. You design a stairway, perhaps, to attract your attention and perhaps have an aesthetic as well as a functional dimension. But on the other hand, when you walk up the stairs, the person should not have to pay conscious attention. They'll just adjust their step to it. And I'm told it's an old feature of medieval castles that the top step would be of a different height. So invading knights who got into the rhythm would trip on the top step where they could be clobbered by the people defending the room. Okay, so, all right. So the other thing I come back to is that although, and I'll probably just flash by the final slides because of time, but although in the last couple of chapters, but one, Neutra does get into the social aspect of You want a community in which people have a sense of interacting with neighbors, with a sense of ownership of the community. And if you're building cities, you really want to design the city so that you do have a neighborhood, and then maybe the freeways aren't sunk down. It gets a little bit like Le Corbusier at times. You have these freeways that remove the traffic from your experience, and so on. But he doesn't really get into the fact that a lot of the brain is a social brain. And in fact, I have a number of slides on something called mirror neurons and what happens when you think about them as part of larger systems in the human brain. But unfortunately, I had to ditch those. But this slide is just to emphasize that in some sense, we're thinking about neurons in persons is sort of the level that we're focusing on. If you're a serious neuroscientist interested in things like disease and genetics and drugs, then you really have to go down to the molecules and membranes. But I think more and more we do have to go up to the level of society. This term schemas, again, that's a whole chapter or so in my book, but the idea here is simply that at times you're going to be engaging with the brain in terms of interacting functions, a sort of functional view of the brain. And those functions can include emotions and aesthetic judgment. But at other times, you really want to get down to what is a brain region doing, what are the circuits in that brain region doing. So I've just thrown up a sort of horror slide to sort of make this point. So going from top left, this is a drawing that, apart from the colors, goes back to about 1905 by an anatomist who dissected little bits out of the cerebral cortex and found that in different areas, although you had the same 6-layered structure of the neurons, the amount devoted to a different layer would vary. And so you really already, that upper layer is already in tens of areas that can be distinguished by their neuronal structure and thus their computations, and which have different inputs and different outputs and different connections. Then we go down and look inside a particular area. This is a drawing by Johnson Dagatai, a Hungarian neuroanatomist, where he's pulled out what some of the typical cells look like and their connections in the cortex. We go down to the work of Sherrington and Eccles, who discovered the electrical interactions, which, since we know, are mediated by very complex molecules. And so we have people doing electron micrographs to see the fine structure. That's sort of one synapses, that strange ovoid structure. And at the right, to be really horrifying, we have the chemical pathways in a couple of synaptic interactions with a cell of the cerebellum. And to me, when I look at that last thing, I say, hey, that's fascinating. And then I retreat to the top level and carry out my career there. And I think that's the level we're going to worry about. This drawing is just to show you 3 drawings by Sandagatai, one by the Nobel laureate who flourished over 100 years ago in Spain, Ramon y Cajal, where you can just see how very different the forms of the neurons and their relation to each other and their connectivity, how much they differ between the cerebral cortex, the one we've already seen down at the bottom right, and then the hippocampus, which is engaged in both memory and navigation, the spinal cord, which is, of course, the major pathway for controlling the sensing and control of our body, and the cerebellum, which is really involved in our graceful movements. But again, I don't think the architect's going to have to worry about that, but this is where the neuroscientists should be fascinated by what can that shape mean in terms of achieving. So how does this form affect the function of that region? Okay, now here we get the point that resonates with the much later quote of Eberhard's: design creates pattern of responses. And I'll just look at the highlighted bit. Many details of our behavior are successfully guided by the linkage of perceptual details to parameters of action. But the difference I've made in the discussion we've just had is that instead of thinking, okay, this is a new conditioned reflex where this is the stimulus that is going to elicit that response, it's much more. I have something to do, like I want to get up to the next floor. Okay, I look around and I recognize the affordance of a flight of stairs. So I'm not responding to a stimulus, I'm finding, as it were, where the stimulus is for my need. And then as I go up the stairs, non-consciously, I'm adjusting my steps. But so that gives you some sense, but the designer must face the world of cortical responses. He can't just make intuitive guesses. Okay. I've already made the idea that affordances can be conscious or unconscious, so I won't repeat that. So the next thing I want to do is just bring in emotion. Now, Neutra does repeatedly make the point that utility and aesthetics cannot be torn apart. If you're design, and yet, of course, in many buildings, we do see them torn apart, where cheap and nasty achieves some basic functionality for the owner, at least, and doesn't think about it. But so this idea of atmosphere, how does a place set a mood, if you will, the serenity of a Japanese garden or the fortitude of a castle? That's going to be an important part of the design. How does the finer aesthetics thing in? So we have a region of the brain called the limbic system, not because it's has anything to do with the limbs, because it's pushing the brain, thrown around the central core of the brainstem. And a friend of mine, Carl Prieber, made the joke that it's responsible for the 4 Fs, but now we've extended that to the 5 Fs. The 4 Fs are feeding, fighting, fleeing, reproduction, and the 5th one is family. And then the debate, the question is, how do you take those basic motivations and build upon them to come up with all the finer emotions? And so in the human, you get to the stage where the emotions are really not driving your immediate behavior in the world or your social interaction, but they're the aesthetic emotions which become strongly cultural. But anyway, as I said, the slogan for Neutra here is there is no pure reason or pure beauty. Emotion most naturally tinges every mind operation. But I must say that as a neuroscientist, working on a brain with possibly several hundred anatomically distinct regions, and depending on how you count, 10 billion or 100 billion neurons, and the neurons may have anything from 4 to 10,000 connection points or synapses. There's no way we can do the whole thing. So we pull out different systems of systems. Anyway, just to you've seen this diagram before. The slogan here is the action perception cycle is a learning cycle. To each time we go around the cycle, there's the possibility of learning something new. And so therefore, Heraclitus has said you can't step in the same river twice. I guess the slogan here is you can't think with the same brain twice. And so one of the discussions Barbara and I were having on the way over is this issue of why is it that certain things are pleasing when repeated again and again and again, and others, you don't want to repeat them again and again, and you're looking for novelty. That's a whole other discussion for another day. But I do want to just show this amazing study, which was part of the discovery that we can't just talk about memory. There are many different kinds of memory, and we can begin to relate those to different parts of the brain. So our physiology, we think about the impact upon a person. Are we nudging them to develop a new habit, or are we creating a one-off aesthetic experience, or what? So this poor guy, HM, had severe epilepsy. And in the late 50s, his surgeon, instead of saying, what's the smallest cut I can make in the brain to stop these storms of epilepsy spreading, he whacked out this huge region of the brain that included not just the hippocampus, but the surrounding temporal lobe. And then poor HM, as he was called, afterwards, lost episodic memory. You know, so he could remember things that had happened to him in the past, but you could be talking to him and leave the room and come back a few minutes later, apologize. And why are you apologizing? I haven't seen you before. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Memento, but this was based on a guy. So your homework for this talk is see the movie Memento. This was a guy who had had a brain trauma and didn't have any memory of what had happened. So he developed. So the second data point, which the auteur did, was that none of us he had procedural memory. So he could, if you played a game with him again and again, he would never remember playing it before, but he became more skillful. He could get new skills, new procedures. So the idea was that this guy, to supplement his memory, had developed two new procedures. One was to have tattoos of things that he needed to know, and the other was to take photos. And what makes the movie so compelling is that it runs backwards. So you don't know what happened earlier. And so you'll see an event where he's basing his behavior on these traces. And then you go back and find out what led to that trace. And then you finally get back to the beginning. You realize that he totally misinterpreted everything. And so momentum. All right. So this is just, I think I'm overdoing it. So let me just skip along to say what this shows is that we also understand there are different ways that the synapses can adapt in different parts of the brain. So one part could just be sort of saying, well, this thing keeps happening to me, so let me take a sort of understanding of the general pattern that's occurred. Whereas another one is saying, this gets a reward for me, and so I'm going to change my connections so that I'm more likely to get rewarded in future. And this can either be learning with a teacher who says, you must do this, like learning the letters of the alphabet, or trying to ride a bike, which is more just a general thing, I'm doing better or we're doing worse. Oh, and just one more thing that was on that slide, these mechanisms that were developed by people trying to model learning in the brain have become the core of the modern AI technology called deep learning, which is now totally reshaping our world. And therefore, one of the things, another topic of interest to us would be, as Neutra said, we're living with mass production. What happens as we live with artificial intelligence? Okay, I think I will just impress you with how much work I did and how bad I am at pruning slides, and just jump on to the last part, which is, as I said, where towards the end, Neutra looks at survival in a rather different way from the individual well-being. So unfortunately, he doesn't tell us how to end war, or how to convince people to be nice to each other, or how to ameliorate climate change, but he has given us some sense of how design can begin to reflect the need for individual physical well-being, clean air, healthy bodies, individual mental well-being, reduce stress, increase motivation. And now the last couple of chapters, but one, is the well-being of a community, well-being in the environment. And I think what I'm just going to do is show you the headlines so that we can stop and get on with the questions. So one interesting thing is chapter 37, which is 29. I must tell you, there are a couple of chapters I really love that were omitted in the new book. Chacun son goût, as they say. Anyway, he has this wonderful title, which is very confusing. Ours is the only meal we can digest. And so this is a long diatribe based in part on a chat he had with a union leader about the fact that when you open up a new factory, the workers want to have homes they can own. And Neutra is saying, better a community in which you can rent and be part of a community rather than saddling yourself with a mortgage for a house that you could never make yours. In other words, that you can't digest. And there's one example that maybe is what he had in mind from the book's 54, that this is from 1941, the Avion village in Texas. This was where the federal government was worried about building all these huge airplane and munitions factories. Where were people going to live? And Neutra was recruited to come up with a development for the workers where a lot of the buildings would be prefabricated, but it would be a sort of garden city idea, so that there would be a lot of green space, kids could move around between houses, people could get together and so on in the green space without having to go across the traffic and things of this kind. And so it was apparently a great success. In 1948, it was sold, but remains to this day a community. And there was a recent talk that is available from AIA San Francisco on Avion Village, where you have a woman who's written a scholarly book on it, and one of the guys who I think is head of the community organization of the people who now live there. And of course, some of it's been a little bit ruined because now people have motor cars, but okay. And then the longest chapter of the book is the rise of cities. And I could take all the time in the world for this, but I think I'll just go right down to the second last paragraph. He wants to take a leaf from studies of embryology. And so the idea of how organisms grow. And so he's trying to say that a city cannot grow in the way that an Italian hillside town could grow from having a church on the top of the hill, and then slowly you grow in what appears to be an organic way around it. So how can we capture something of that neighborhood sense? And this is sort of, I think, the opposite of the Jane Jacobs approach. We are sort of thinking about a neighborhood of a certain kind, but it is a world of mass production, a world of freeways. And you're trying to, I'd be interested to hear from anybody who knows whether Neutra had an opinion of Robert Moses or Le Corbusier. Okay, so here, 50 pages from the end of the book is what might serve as the peroration. Using all available means, we may hope to design and build more soundly for the multitudes of human beings who cannot extricate themselves from the confines and the fastnesses of contemporary industrialized environment. Step by step, we may thus erect a safe stairway leading to a more wholesome and more spacious level of man-conditioned existence, human condition. Even if the topmost landing on the panoramic view to reward the long ascent may never come into our sight during our own brief span of life. And with that, I close. I hope I've convinced you that Neutra's ideas are very much alive. After 7 years, I mentioned that the book reflects not only his deep experience as an architect, but wide reading in history and philosophy, occasional flashes of wit. The new edition coming out early next year will have a lot of pictures in it. We're placed within the chapters, so you will have a richer experience reading it. I still lament the missing chapters, but never mind. I've introduced you to John Eberhard as sort of a bridging figure who reflected on some of the things that had happened in the decades up to the 2000s in deciding to talk about the coexistence of neuroscience and architecture. In my own book from a year ago, When Brains Meet Buildings, I'm delighted with this photograph, which I happen to remember I had after I'd chosen the title for the book. I was walking down Unter den Linden in Berlin and looked down a side street, and here was this sculpture where obviously a brain is meeting a building. But my subtitle was A Conversation Between Neuroscience and Architecture. And I think that if we take neuroscience in the broad sense that Neutra took his physiology and that I've tried to establish in this talk, that I think we do indeed have the grounds for a very meaningful partnership in achieving survival through design. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
and you're on.
I am on. Yes, thank you, Michael. That was fantastic, as well I expected it to be. And you've given us a lot to chew on, as you always do. So before we start asking some questions, I just want to remind everybody, if you'd like to ask Michael a question and you're watching virtually, please just go ahead and chat that into the chat function. While we're waiting for that to happen, I just would like to know if anybody who's in the audience with you at the office today has a question. Are there any raised hands, Michael? And if you wouldn't mind, for the audience at home, we may not be able to hear the actual question. So if you could just sort of restate the question before answering, that would be wonderful.
I think at the moment they're waiting for a remote audience, but maybe they'll start raising hands.
Well, that's okay. We can make that happen later on as well. So, so here, it looks like there's going to be a question in here, but it's certainly a comment from someone who knows a little bit about this topic, and that's from Richard Neutra's son, Raymond Neutra, who is also a doctor. So I'm reading this freshly with you, Michael. We'll see what Raymond has to say. He says, the effects of designed environments can be recorded by scientists focusing on different levels of organization. For example, how it affects what they do, how they socialize, the excellence of their performance, and the probability of disease. Neuroscience is largely about the mechanisms through which these other endpoints are produced. Could you, Michael, also comment on when mechanistic understanding is most useful?
In a word? No. No, I mean, I think what's interesting, of course, is that Raymond is an expert on medical epidemiology. And so this is one of the cases where the human well-being would depend, I think, very much on his methods rather than on the neuroscience. If we're talking about the experience of the building, the aesthetic experience, the utility, and so on, the bringing of this action perception cycle into the way you interact with the building with this strong emotional overtone, then I think that is where neuroscience can come into play. But I think also his point was touching on, from a different perspective, on the idea about typology. So that in different buildings, there will be certain things about, hey, people have got to breathe and they've got to be comfortable, and that may have general lessons, and then there'll be specific lessons for different areas. And then one other point is that when you get beyond a certain point, a whole, which is sort of hinted at, though I didn't get into it in the last couple of chapters, is this whole sense of what is society? Are you creating a society based on individual expression, or a society based on you being a servant of the state, for example? And presumably there are different architectures to meet that. And then the neuroscientist, the psychologist, and the political scientist are in some sense working together.
I must say I enjoyed very much while you were talking about, in particular, adaptive technology for the fabrics of buildings, and you talked about louvers. I couldn't help but notice that right directly behind you are a series of louvers that Mr. Neutra built into the office building. But I believe those are operated manually, not mechanized. But it just shows you how some of these things really like we're playing out in real time, just given your surroundings. I'm also, we've been working with several folks to kind of edit and reformulate the book. And an observation has been made that Neutra wrote the book in a way that he didn't really necessarily mean it to be read sequentially, that the chapters, you could pick up a chapter here, you could pick up a chapter there, you could pick up a chapter anywhere else, rather than sort of a cover to cover read. And I was curious if you found that to be true. Does it surprise you, having read the whole thing? Do you feel like that's an appropriate way to access, access this kind of material? I'm just curious.
Well, Raymond asked me to basically come up with a sort of reader's guide. And I think that there are, for example, at the beginning, there are chapters which express the worldview, as I say, of somebody who's been through World War II, who's reflecting upon, yes, we need design. Yes, the design must be reflective of mass production and so on. And so I could see those few chapters as being a separate block. Mm-hmm. And you can either say, hey, that fascinates me, it sets the stage, I want to read it, or I want to jump into the physiology. And again, the last 3 or 4 chapters are the ones where we get into this thing about building a neighborhood and the notion of ownership of a home and so on. I think that provides the social dimension that is not as prominent in earlier chapters. The 2 chapters where we talk about the optical illusions and then the auditory sense and then get into all the other senses, that would make a little block. If you want to say, I'm somebody who's been thinking about architecture too much and how my building is going to look like in a glossy magazine, let me get a dose of thinking about the material as the way it can stimulate other senses and so on. I'm working with an architect. You're very noisy with whatever you're bouncing on the table.
Oh, I don't think it's me, but oh, sorry.
Yeah. So the design of a restaurant and the issue of taste and smell becomes very much something that you want the architecture to enhance in a good way. So yeah, I think that one can read certain blocks, but so hopefully the document I'll come up with in a few weeks will be a good reference for people who want to segregate their reading. But I still recommend reading the whole book. And just when it gets to the conditioned reflexes, Don't take it too seriously, but it's okay.
All right, here comes another question. This is a bit of a long one, so bear with me. It says, back in the late 1960s in architecture school, we learned about societal and sociofugal spaces. Oh boy, here we go. Sociopetal spaces are designed to bring people together, whereas sociofugal spaces minimize contact between individuals. Coined in 1957 by British psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, these two systems for patterning space are part of a larger science known as proxemics, the study of the use of space and its effect on behavior, communication, and social interaction. You can see examples of these spatial principles at work throughout our society today. For example, sociopetal spaces encompass parks, playgrounds, cafes, and restaurants, while sociofugal spaces include church pews, lecture halls, library carrels, office cubicles, airport lounges, and supermarkets. What relationships does proxemics play or inform, if any, to your studies of the brain, neuroscience, and perhaps Neutra?
Well, what's interesting about the examples is I'm not convinced that the labels sociofugal and sociopetal apply to them very well. In other words, yes, a park is a place where people are not lined up to all be sitting together. But part of the charm of a park is that you can meet a friend and walk your dog there with them, or you can sit on a bench together. So it is a large setting for small sociofugal events. And no, sociopetal events, sorry. So obviously botany is the subject here. Sociopetal, okay. So on the other hand, church pews are sort of strange, aren't they? Because in one way, you're sitting separately from other people. You're meant to be, or in a lecture hall, you're not meant to be interact with the people next to you, except in the church, you may engage in hymns. And then you are engaged in where you also, and you are then definitely sociopetal. The rest of the time, although you're in spatial proximity, you are not in social proximity. So I think the answer, so the long answer to the question is, I think proxemics is a very important component of design, but I think one needs this sort of micro-analysis to see, in some ways, not a dichotomy of sociofugal and sociopetal, but rather how do you blend them in different proportions in different spaces.
It makes a lot of sense. So does anyone in the room with you have any questions? Any raised hands?
Barbara.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's interesting to hear a different perspective. I was rather different in some ways and very similar in others. I was interested in the definition or the enlargement of affordance, and you had conscious affordance, which is very accessible, right? It's architects might call it an opportunity, if not a design strategy or something like that. But what I was unfamiliar with is unconscious affordance, because I think of, okay, I'm greeted by a stare and I choose, I move, my eyes look to that, I move to that with my body. But how is that an unconscious affordance? I'm not clear on that.
Let me answer. So Barbara Lamprecht's question was, she gets the idea of a conscious affordance, but not a non-conscious affordance. Now, interestingly, for J.J. Gibson, the classical notion of the affordance was the non-conscious. The idea that you don't have to go through conscious perception of what an object is and make a judgment about it to decide what to do. And so that example I gave of you're walking along a street and suddenly you move out of the way to avoid a collision was sort of the primary Gibsonian affordance. Or you're walking up a hill and the gradient of texture on the hill lets you know how to adjust your footfalls to the incline and so on. So I think for Gibson, he would say exactly the opposite of Barbara. An affordance is the way in which the environment can influence your behavior without you having to ask what object or person is influencing. And then I insist that for it to be useful, you need to extend it to saying, but it's an opportunity for action generally. And so it may be you recognize something that has the property, you recognize a doorway. You look for the doorway as a place to exit. And then in terms of positioning yourself to get through the door, there may be unconscious affordances at play. Then Tonino Grafero, who's one of the big people on this notion of atmosphere, came along and said, I'd like to generalize affordance from a practical action to emotion or mood. And so he introduced the idea of the architectural affordance or the atmospheric affordance. And we have a little book coming out sometime next year in which we have a paper in which we've tried to reconcile my neuroscience with his phenomenology. And it's very painful. And we have to keep putting the paragraphs, studying Arbib says and Grafero says. But we've got a bunch of interesting people who write commentaries. And then to reduce the mental strain, Tonino Grafero will make his response as a phenomenologist, and I will make my response as a neuroscientist. But I think that will really be a very strong statement, not about the primary question about conscious versus non-conscious, but it will be thinking about this extension to bring the emotional making. And then that gets into one of Neutra's slogans, is you can't separate utility and beauty, and so in some sense, etc., etc. Juhani Ballasmar's big example would be the door handle, right? That
I was just going to say, like the architect or designer could, for example, expose aggregate on concrete in order to provide the user with that unconscious ability to navigate that area in the rain and in ice or something like that. The architect desires to make that an unconscious, but it is a conscious, I don't know.
No, I mean, we have to be very careful. In a lot of these discussions, we have to be careful to separate what the architect does from what the user of the building does.
Mm-hmm.
So the architect is consciously thinking, what can I anticipate about the non-conscious behavior, right? So in the case of walking down the street and avoiding collisions, that's a natural situation. Nobody's designing it. But in designing a doorway, for example, you may think about the doorway in terms of, I know what the traffic flow is going to be, what's the size, so that if somebody's approaching, then the two of them can non-consciously avoid collision. And that's distinct from how I want to design the frame of the doorway to attract attention. Or maybe it's a servant's doorway and I want to make it as unobtrusive as possible so only the servant will know about it. So I think that addresses what Barbara just said to me, is the fact that the designer may be consciously thinking about what cues will help the person use the building without having to keep thinking about what do I do next, but just doing it. In their normal behavior.
So a follow-up question to that about affordances is, how do you think the design of affordances in a learning environment helps with brain plasticity and better cognitive abilities? Is the new innovative learning environment we see today in Australian schools, for instance, conducive to improved learning performance, do you think?
Well, I talked to the people who were part of the introduction of this system, but I didn't have a chance to discuss evaluation of it. But one of the things I noted is that I gave classes where I made the slides available to my class. And so a lot of students will be diligently looking at their computers throughout the class, but I had no idea whether they were looking at my slides or their video game. And the nature of it was that there was no way of making sure the student was engaged and in some sense taking a personal responsibility for using the material as it was presented. Now, this group of 6 means, in a way, if you cheat, there are 5 people sitting at the same table who know you're not pulling your weight. And so you create this mini community of people who have been placed in a situation where contributing to rather than just passively accepting as part of it, because with that structure of the shared screen and the individual screens, you can go back and forth between sharing ideas and working for a while yourself, sharing what you came up with and so on. So I'm prepared to think that it's very promising, but it's just a few years old, and I don't know if there's any careful comparative study, but it's certainly better than what I faced.
Well, Michael, I think we're going to have to leave it there for today. Thank you so much. I want to just remind everybody about the book. It's called When Brains Meet Buildings, with that fantastic image that you got on the cover. A conversation between neuroscience and architecture, which we have just barely scratched the surface of today. But I hope that everyone will use the link that I will be sending out to purchase the book. And as I mentioned before, we are recording this. And so once we have an edited version of a video available, we will be sending that out to everyone so that you can share it with others, as well as revisit anything you might want to revisit again. So thank you so much, Michael. Thank you to everyone for attending. I think we will probably not have much more programming between now and the end of the year, but in 2023, the Institute will be happy to return to both some in-person as well as some ongoing virtual events like the one we had today. So thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Michael, for reading and doing your homework. I'm going to go rent Memento now and do mine. So take good care, and thanks everybody.
Thanks everybody. Thank you. Bye.